This video is marine biology for Cornerstone Academy, and in this video we are going to cover both modules 9 and 10. And because we did dissections during class last week, we didn't get to discuss module 9. So we have just 1 hour to do both modules 9 and modules 10. So I'm going to really hit just the most important parts, and when you're tested, you will only be tested on those parts that we actually discuss in class. Okay, so let's start with module 9. And module 9 deals with the intertidal zone. So you'll remember that a couple modules ago we divided the ocean and the shore near the ocean into different zones, one of which was the intertidal zone. But let me remind you that in the intertidal zone is covered during high tide and it is exposed during low tide. So with the level of the water moving in and out as a result of the tides, that creates a unique ecosystem and unique challenges to the organisms that live in that ecosystem. So let's talk about that a little bit. So low tide is a time of stress for organisms that live in the intertidal area. So why do we say it is it's a time of stress? Well, one is that during low tide, those organisms are going to be exposed to air. And as you know, that could mean that it could be hot, or it could be freezing. So they have to deal with a wide range of temperature variation. Secondly, they might be exposed to fresh water due to rain. So remember, these organisms they're living in a saltwater environment, and yet during low tide, if it's raining, they're going to get exposed to fresh water, and they're going to have to deal with that. And then another aspect of the stress that they have to deal with is that they will be exposed to land predators. So whether these are birds or rats or other small animals, when they are uncovered during the low tide, those organisms that's going to present an aspect of stress during low tide. So then during high tide, they're going to return to a marine environment. So here it's going to be a more moderate temperature. The temperatures, you're not going to get those swings in temperature that you would during low tide. The salinity is going to be higher because they're going to be just covered in the salt water. And they're also, during high tide, they're going to have more nutrients because more nutrients and oxygen, because it is the water that usually is going to carry those nutrients to the organisms. So these we would all generally think of as being positive effects, but well, let's add one more. So the waves can also be a positive thing, because they carry off waste, and the waves also carry in nutrients to the organisms that are living in this intertidal area. So on the one hand, we can think of waves as being a positive aspect for the high tide. However, don't lose sight of the fact that the waves could also be something that causes stress to the organisms living during high tide, because what would those waves do? Well, they could wash away some organisms. So some organisms might have difficulty maintaining their hold within the intertidal zone because of the wave action. And then in addition to that, the waves can also push debris or other organisms into a particular organism. And so that may crush them. So that obviously is a stressor to those organisms living within the intertidal zone during high tide. So in general, we would say that high tide is presents more favorable conditions, but that doesn't mean that there aren't any unfavorable conditions. So generally, when we think of the intertidal zone, we think of two main types. There's the rocky intertidal zone, and then the other one, I want to make sure I get the other one is like a sandy, muddy intertidal zone. So let me show you a picture of each of those so that we can get an idea of those. So here's an example of a rocky intertidal zone. So you can see that there would be portions of this that would be uncovered during the low tide and covered during the high tide. And then if we want to see a picture of a soft bottom, so sandy or muddy intertidal zone, that would be more of what we think of when we are going to a beach. This happens to be a beach in Hawaii. So generally we think of those two types of intertidal zones. They are either rocky, or they're the kind of softer sand intertidal zone. So let's start by talking a little bit about the rocky intertidal zone. And we're really just going to hit some high points on this, focusing on how organisms have to adapt, or what kind of factors they have to deal with while living in this particular habitat. Um, so as we've already said, they might get exposed to air. And so when they are exposed to air, they face the problem of drying out. And that drying out, the term that we use for that is desiccated or desiccation. And so organisms living here have to, how are they going to deal with this possibility of drying out? Well, they can do that in several ways. One, they can go to a shaded area. So this is when they are exposed during low tide. So they can go to places like rock crevices, or they might go to a tide pool. So a tide pool is an area where water has pooled. And then another way that they can deal with the danger of drying out is that they can trap moisture underneath themselves or within themselves. And now we'll look at, let me show you some pictures of this. Okay, so so you can see when you think about hiding in rock crevices or finding shade, you know, there are opportunities for that in a rocky intertidal zone. And then I mentioned that, so there are places where water tends to pool, like this right here, and that's called a tidal pool. So we can see where water pools here, or here, or here. So during the low tide, the organisms, animals living in this area can find moisture in those low tide areas. And then the other thing I mentioned was that they can trap water within themselves. So this organism is called a limpet. And what the limpet can do is that it can seal itself against a rock and it can trap moisture underneath it. And that makes it more likely to be able to survive during a dry period. So dealing with changes in moisture is one, and the danger of drying out. Sort of related to that are the changes in temperature. So we've already said that during low tide, you could be dealing with very low temperatures or very high temperatures that these organisms are going to be exposed to. So, you know, they can move to the sun or away from the sun. So they can move to the sun or to the shade to escape extremes in temperature. Some of them are able to keep an extra supply of water within their bodies, and that will help them to be able to deal with these drastic changes in temperature. And the other thing is that often, depending on the environment that the organism, where the environment where the organism lives, the shell color will vary. So if you're in the tropics where it's very warm, you are more likely, animals living in that environment have lighter colored shells so that the sun will be reflected rather than being absorbed. And in colder environments, the shell color would tend to be darker. Okay, then the other factor that they have to be able to deal with are changes in salinity. And so during low tide, water is going to evaporate, and that means salinity is going to increase. So low tide would tend to have higher salinity than during high tide. But then, as we said before, if it rains, that's going to cause a decrease in salinity. The water that these animals would be exposed to would have less concentration of salt. So how can they deal with this? Well, they deal with it in several ways. One is that they can close their shells if they have a shell, and that helps to shield them against the changes in the salinity of the water. Another way is that they can actually burrow. So we'll see, especially next chapter, there are a lot of organisms that burrow in the part of the area that is on the bottom we call the substrate. So the bottom surface is called the substrate, and so organisms will burrow into that as a way of escaping these huge changes in salinity. In terms of feeding in these areas, most of the organisms that live in this area are filter feeders. So, they're depending on food being carried to them by the water. And so they're going to feed primarily at high tide. And that means that they're not going to be able to be eating all day. They may be underwater for only a short period of time, so they have to eat when they are covered, knowing, and then they'll have periods of time when they won't be able to eat during low tide because the water is not bringing food into these organisms to eat. So they have to make the most of their feeding during the high tide. In terms of reproduction for these organisms, many of these are sessile, and what we mean by sessile is that they cannot move. So they attach themselves to the bottom of the substrate. So they are attached to the bottom. So what does that mean? Well, if they can't move, then they can't move around to find a mate. So how do they deal with this? Well, in the intertidal pool, for many organisms, the eggs and the sperm that are produced are planktonic. And you should remember that means that they float along with the water. So this means that the egg and the sperm would be carried out with the tide. And then as we've talked about previously, then it's a matter of chance whether the egg and sperm will meet up for fertilization. But it's important that the gametes, the eggs and sperm, are planktonic so that they can be carried out, and that increases the likelihood of fertilization taking place. The other thing that will happen then is that the larva, so once fertilization takes place, then the larvae are carried back by the ocean waves, carried back by waves and water movement to the intertidal zone, where they then the larvae then develop and mature. So the eggs are laid in the intertidal zone, but then those eggs and sperm are carried out to the ocean, and if fertilization takes place, then the larvae will then be carried back in to the intertidal zone, where they will mature, become adults, and then then the process starts all over again. Now, one of the really important concepts of the intertidal zone is something that we call zonation. So zonation of intertidal zone. And we'll first look at a rocky one, but this also is it's also true of the soft surface within, if it's an intertidal zone with a soft surface. So let me show you this picture here. Okay, so what I want you to see from this picture is that there are organisms that are living and growing on this rocky, in this rocky intertidal zone, and they live at different or at specific heights. Okay, so here we see this white, whatever this organism, it's pretty high. Then we see a different type of organism growing here on this rock at kind of a medium height, and then we have even a lower height organism here. So that's what we mean by zonation. Similar organisms are located at specific heights, and so it's a zonation that is vertical. So similar organisms are located at specific heights. And that's what we saw in that picture there. So here, how do we explain that how do we explain this phenomenon? Well, marine biologists think that the upper limit of where something can live let's say, the upper limit of where an organism can live is determined by abiotic factors. And I'll ask you to remember what abiotic means. So abiotic factors are those factors that aren't related to, it's like non-living factors. So this would be things like sun exposure, how much water is available, the wave action, so all these non-living factors. So marine biologists think that the upper limit of where an organism can live is determined by abiotic factors. Okay, then they think that the lower limit of where an organism can live, so the lower limit of where an organism can live is determined by biotic factors. Biotic factors. Okay, so what would that be? This would be things like food. How much food is available? How much competition is there between different species that live in there? What predators are there that could impact whether an organism can live there? So upper limit of where they can live is determined by abiotic factors. Lower limit is determined by biotic factors. And so what we believe happens is that organisms live somewhere between these two limits. So if we look at our picture again, so we know that for this lichen that is growing here, that this area where it is growing is between its upper limit that was determined by abiotic factors and its lower limit that was determined by biotic factors. So it's going to live somewhere between its upper and lower limit. So in general, we divide the intertidal zone into 3 areas, and we pretty much saw that on that figure, this other figure that we looked at. So there's an upper intertidal zone, there's a middle intertidal zone, and a lower intertidal zone, all of those would be defined and dictated by the abiotic and biotic factors. And they're going to be different. So the abiotic factors faced by this upper are going to be different than the abiotic factors dealt with by a lower intertidal area. And the same thing is true of biotic. Down here in the bottom, they're probably not going to have to deal too much with like predators like birds or other shore type animals. Whereas if in this upper intertidal zone, that's something that's going to be more of a factor that the organisms are going to have to deal with. Okay, so so that is an important concept with regard to where you will find things based on what physical forces, abiotic factors, and then based on biotic factors that that they would have to deal with, and they will live somewhere within those two areas. Okay, I want to say just a few things then about organisms living in, so that we've dealt primarily with the rocky intertidal zone, but let's now look a little bit at the sandy and muddy intertidal zone. So here we have more of like loose sediment. So living in this area, you're going to have a lot more burrowing of organisms. They will burrow down into the sand or the mud compared to the rocky intertidal. And usually also the wave action is not as rough as it is in a rocky intertidal zone. So the organisms living here don't need to deal as much with that, with really strong wave action. In order to live in the mud, so as you can imagine, the mud has less oxygen than if it's deeper. Water doesn't penetrate it as well, so there's less oxygen available, and also there's going to be less light. So as you might guess, then that means that there's less photosynthesis that's able to take place in organisms that are living in the mud. So they really have to get their oxygen from the water. As the water, seeps down into the mud as much as it can, but then that also means that if you get deep down where the water can't penetrate as easily, it's going to be pretty anaerobic. So there's not going to be, so anaerobic means without oxygen. And so remember we talked about the fact that there are anaerobic bacteria. So a lot of the organisms that would live deep down would be those types of organisms that can survive without oxygen. And then other organisms that are able to live in the mud, there are some types of worms and clams that are able to live here, and those organisms would need to, these organisms would eat, dead decaying matter, because they're not going to have a lot of living matter available to them deep down in the mud. What about predators in this area? So in a sandy tidal area, well, fish and snails they'll tend to prey on animals that live in the mud. So what they will do is they will eat the soft or fleshy parts that are sticking out. And then, of course, birds also will put their beaks into the mud during low tide. So organisms, so this is, these are predators. What are the predators that organisms in the mud and sand have to deal with? Zonation also exists within the muddy areas. So let's see here. So this shows the zonation of a sandy beach area. So you can see that, sea cucumbers are able to survive at a lower depth. They would still be covered during the low tide, but then you get all the way up to land crabs and sand fleas that would the zone in which they can survive would be closer to the surface, and they would be more likely to be uncovered during even during high tide situations. So you see the zonation in a sandy or muddy area in the same way that you see that we saw with the rocky area. Okay, so that is going to be it for Module 9. Now we're going to switch into Module 10. And Module 10 is dealing with estuary communities. And a lot of Module 10 is just going to be helping us to understand some definitions so that when we deal with future modules, we have these words down and we can use them without having to define them every time we use them. Okay, so an estuary community. What do we mean by an estuary community? Well, this is where oceans border the land. So in other words, this is where fresh water joins salt water. So that's what we mean when we talk about an estuary, where the oceans border land or where fresh water joins salt water. Okay, so this would be the mouth of a river. The area around the mouth of a river when it dumps into the ocean would be an estuary. So let's talk about some estuaries that maybe you are familiar with in this country. So the San Francisco Bay is an estuary. Tampa Bay, have ever been to Florida and on the west coast of the Florida Peninsula is Tampa Bay, and then another one is the Mississippi Delta. So where the Mississippi River empties into the Gulf of Mexico down in New Orleans is the Mississippi Delta. And so all of these estuaries have unique characteristics that determine the type of ecosystem that is there. So often where there are estuaries, there's often been the establishment of cities because it's a waterway and there's food available. So that many cities have been established near these estuaries. How do these estuaries develop? Well, or what factors? Most scientists believe that when the Ice Age ended, that there was a large amount of ice that melted, and sea levels rose. And so when those sea levels rose, then water moved into lower lands and into the mouths of rivers, and then that led to the formation of these estuaries. So in terms of estuaries, there are several different types. One is called a drowned river valley. And this is also sometimes called a coastal plain estuary. And what you will have with this type of estuary is you will have narrow, deep areas. And those narrow, deep areas would have been the original riverbed. And then, so you would have narrow, deep areas, and you will have broad, shallow areas. And these broad, shallow areas would be a result of ocean levels rising when the ice melted. So I'll show you a picture of one of this type of estuary. And I'm sorry, I guess I did not copy that one. But if you look at figure, oh, I do have that. Let's see. I just need to find it. Here it is. Okay. So here's an estuary from the Columbia River. So this is between the states of Washington and Oregon. And so remember we said that you have these narrow, deep areas, which would be here, and then you have the broad, shallow areas, and all this would have been formed, the narrow, deep areas that are surrounded by broad, shallow areas. So the narrow, deep areas would be most likely due to what would have been the original riverbed, and the shallow areas would have been a result of the melting of ice that took place when the Ice Age ended. Okay, so that's the drowned river estuary. That's one type of estuary. Okay, a second type of estuary is a bar-built estuary. And you would probably think about refer to this as a sandbar. So sand and mud get moved by the waves, and then that sand and mud build up to form a barrier. So it's basically a barrier between the ocean and the salt water. I mean, between the ocean and the fresh water of the river. Between the ocean water and the fresh water. So, in other words, the fresh water would be more concentrated toward the land. So, fresh water near the land. And the salt water would be concentrated more toward the ocean. And one place that we have these bar-built estuaries in the United States is in the Gulf of Mexico. And also, if you've ever been to the islands off the coast of North Carolina, that is another place in the United States where we have these bar-built estuaries. So it's a very large sandbar that can actually become an island that is called a barrier island. Okay, so that's a second type of estuary. A third type of estuary is a fjord. And in a fjord, what happened is that glaciers moved near the coast and created these deep valleys. And then those deep valleys will fill with, when the ice melted, then those valleys either became filled or partially filled. So one place where there are a lot of fjords is in Norway. We'll put a picture of a fjord. Okay, here's a fjord. So as glaciers moved near the land, it created these deep valleys, and then as water melted, those deep valleys filled with water. Okay, so that is a fjord. Okay, another type of estuary is a river delta. And this is where a river flows into the ocean. And what happens when you have a river flowing into the ocean is that the banks get eroded. So the banks of the river erode. And of course, when they erode, what are they carrying? Well, they're carrying sediment. That's carrying sediment. And that sediment then gets deposited along the coast. And you have a delta. I've already mentioned this, but the Mississippi Delta And if you've studied ancient Egypt or even current day Egypt, there is the Nile Delta. Okay, so let me show you a picture of the Mississippi Delta. This is it. Oh, actually, this is the Nile Delta. Okay, so as the river flows into the ocean here, okay, so as the river is flowing in, the banks of the river get eroded and carry all this sediment in with it. So you get this sediment that's deposited along the coast, and that is called a delta. Okay, then the last type of estuary that we will talk about is called a tectonic estuary. And in a tectonic estuary, this happens, remember the Earth is made up of plate crusts and plates. So this type of estuary is due to the movement of crusts and diverse crusts and plates. So as you get this movement, you get holes and basins formed. And then those fill with water. And that creates an estuary. So an example of an estuary that is believed to have been formed in this way is the San Francisco Bay. So let me see. Here it is. Okay, so here's San Francisco Bay. And so you have these basins that form likely due to movement of plates in the crust of the ocean, and then those fill with ocean water, and that creates this estuary. So it's San Francisco Bay, an example of a tectonic estuary. So let me write that as San Francisco Bay. Okay, is an example of a tectonic estuary. Just like when we were talking about intertidal zones, we also have to discuss what factors influence the ability of organisms to live in an estuary. So let's first talk about some abiotic factors in an estuary. Okay, so one big one is the salinity, because so on average, the ocean is about 35%. Its salinity is about 35%. So this is the salinity of salt water. And of course, for fresh water, the salinity is 0. So when an organism is closer to the ocean, obviously they're going to have higher salinity, and close to the river they're going to have lower salinity. Well, what happens when you have tides coming in? So as the tides, low tide and high tide, that means that during the tides, the amount of fresh water and salt water is constantly going to be changing in these areas. In an estuary. So you're going to have less salt water toward the shore, and salt water is going to be what happened. The salt water tends to be more dense, so it stays on the bottom. Fresh water is less dense, so it stays on the top. But as salt water moves across the bottom with the tides, and fresh water moves across the top, so organisms that are living here have to be able, they're going to be exposed to different salinities all in one day. And so that is an important factor for organisms that live near an estuary, is having to deal with those changes in salinity throughout the day. Just like before, the other thing that they have to deal with besides changes in salinity is they have to be able to deal with changes in temperature. So they're going to get exposed to air during low tide, and that will affect the temperature. It could be hot or it could be cold. And then the other thing is that as sediment gets moved around with the tide, so in these estuaries you have a lot more sediment in the water, and that means that the water will be less clear because of that sediment. And because that water is less clear, that means light won't penetrate as well. And if light isn't penetrating, that means that photosynthesis. So that means that photosynthesis is affected. Photosynthesis won't be able to take part as well, won't be able to happen as well because of the decreased clarity of the water, and therefore the decreased light that can penetrate the environment. So because these organisms have to deal with different levels of salinity, we have some terms that we use to describe them. So one term is euryhaline, it's an H, and these are organisms that can tolerate a wide range of salinity. Stenohaline are organisms that can tolerate a narrow change in salinity. So they're not very tolerant of changes in salinity. And then lastly, a term that maybe you've heard is called brackish. And brackish is a condition that is less salty than seawater. So it's kind of a mixture. Less salty than seawater. So, not a mixture, but it's kind of in between seawater and fresh water. Less salty than seawater, but more salty than fresh water. So there are organisms that can survive in a brackish environment. So if there are some organisms that can tolerate a wide range of salinity, some cannot tolerate much range in salinity. So we've used these words before, but let's throw them out there again because they relate to organisms being able to adjust to changes in salinity. So in an osmoconformer, the body fluids change salinity to match the outside. So body fluids change their salinity to match the outside environment. So in an estuary, their salinity changes often because of water change, because the salinity of the water changes often. So an example of this would be a sea anemone. So as the salinity of the water changes, sea anemones are able to change the salinity of their bodies. That is an osmoconformer. And another term that we've seen before is an osmoregulator. And an osmoregulator is one in which they are able to maintain constant salinity within their body. And they do this because they have their kidneys and their gills have mechanisms in which they can regulate the salt content of their body. Salt levels of the body. So in this case, it doesn't matter for an osmoregulator as the salinity of their environment changes, they're able to keep their internal salinity the same. So organisms that are osmoregulators, most fish are osmoregulators, and also crustaceans like crabs and lobsters and crayfish. Though they are osmoregulators. And then a last way that they deal with it, some organisms just reduce their exposure to the changing salinity. So how do they do that? Well, they can do it by, they can close their shells. Or they can burrow into the mud. And both of these things will mean that the salinity within the body of the organism will not vary as much. I think I had a figure there. Let's see. 0.9. So here, this figure shows. In this area over here, so these are organisms that live primarily in a saltwater environment. And then as you move over here, so these are still saltwater. Then as you get into here, you get more of a brackish. So you have certain organisms that can live in this area because they are brackish. They can live in that area that's partway. It's not as salty as the ocean, but has more salt than the fresh water. And then you have those species that live best in fresh water. Okay, so these would be the species living here would be stenolene, because they are not able to they can only tolerate very narrow rate changes. So over here would be stenolene organisms, because they can't change, they can't tolerate changes as well. But then here, so here we have organisms that the triangles would be represented by euryhaline, because they can live in a very salty environment, but they can also live in a brackish environment. So they can tolerate wide ranges of salinity. Okay, so that is how organisms deal with changes in salinity. Some of them are able to vary their deal with wide ranges, and others are not, and so they have to have ways to be able to compensate for that. Let's see. What else do we have time for? I want to just mention a couple different types of estuary habitats. And most of these you've probably heard of, so we won't spend a lot of time on them. So one type of estuary habitat is a wetland. Wetlands are they're usually at higher elevations, so they're not, real close to the sea, and sometimes they can be covered with water at high tide. But they wouldn't be covered at low tide. And so one type of wetland is a salt marsh. We talked about salt marshes a little bit before. So there are plants that can survive in a salt marsh that are, they are able to deal with the salt area. Sometimes you'll see burrowing animals living here. So things like mussels, snails, clams, shrimp. Sometimes you'll have large birds and fish that are predators in this area. So large birds and fish are predators in a salt marsh. I don't know if I have a picture of a salt marsh. Let's see. Well, yeah, this is a good picture because it shows the wetland here. So this is a wetland that contains a salt marsh, and you can see that sometimes during high tide, some of these plants could be covered. Another type of wetland besides a salt marsh, so wetlands, one type of wetland is a salt marsh, but another type of wetland, so wetland that's right in here, we have a salt marsh. And another type of wetland that we've already talked about are the mangrove forests. And there's different types of mangroves, but you may remember that we talked about how those mangroves, as sediment moves in around them, they can actually form islands. So here, I guess I think I have a picture of a mangrove. Yeah, so here's some mangrove forests. So you can see these trees that live, and then the sediment builds up, and you can form, they can fill in the land and form these islands. And then also these roots, that grow, these can actually grow out of the water so that they can get oxygen. And then there are some types of mangroves that have salt glands so that they can actually get rid of the salt. They can excrete the salt through their salt glands. Then the other thing on this previous picture we saw was this mud flat area. So within an estuary, there can be wetlands. Then there are mud flat areas. Water doesn't move very well through mud. So in a mud flat area, you're going to get a lot of anaerobic conditions. So you're going to see things living here that can eat dead, decaying organisms. So even just a few inches below the surface, you're going to have a lot of decomposing bacteria that live here. So decomposing bacteria. And then also in a mudflat, you're going to get burrowing animals living here. So you will get organisms that are buried in the sediment. One thing about the mudflats is that there aren't a lot of species in the mudflat, but there are a lot of organisms. So mudflat, not a lot of different species. The conditions are difficult to survive because you're not getting much oxygen, but the species that do live there are in large numbers. So not a lot of variety of species, but however, they are present in very large numbers. So they feed on the sediment that is brought in by the rivers. Let me say one more thing and then we'll stop. In this mudflat area, birds will often feed in the mudflat area, and what we see is that they will have different bill lengths depending on what they eat. So if you have a mud flat and you have organisms burrowed in here, organisms will bury it. They'll bury themselves at different depths, and you'll have different species at different depths. So the birds have a beak length that is suitable to the species that they eat. And what this means is that no one species of organism that is buried gets eaten up and where there are none left. But it also means that it keeps any one organism from taking over, because you have different species of birds eating organisms at different depths. So somewhere I have a picture of different beaks. Having trouble getting that up. Okay, so I guess I don't seem to have that picture, but you can look in your book at figure figure 10.13 will show you how different birds will have different lengths of beaks that is suitable to the organism and the depth at which that organism lives that they eat. One last area that is around an estuary is called a channel, and we will stop then after we talk just briefly about a channel. So a channel is an area that has water in it at both low tide and high tide. Water is present at low tide and high tide. Often these channels are used by fish for spawning or to raise their young. So remember when we used the word anadromous. So these are fish that mate and give birth in fresh water, but then they spend their adult lives in salt water. Well, one of the things that anadromous fish will do is that they may use a channel as like a stopping point. To eat, to feed, but it also helps them to adjust to changes in salinity. So as they're moving from salt water to ocean water or vice versa, stopping in one of these channels can help them to adjust to those changes. because in these areas you're going to get more changing in salinity, and so they can use that time to help them adjust to that. So we go back to, okay, so here you can see the channel then. Okay, so this is the channel. You see it's underwater but during both low tide and high tide, and it can be a place where it can be a resting place as fish move between the ocean and between freshwater streams. So in general, what we would say about estuaries is that they have few species, but a lot of organisms. Okay, because the species that are there are present in large numbers. So not as much variety as you might find in other habitats, but that doesn't mean that it's not a diverse and productive ecosystem, because there's lots of nutrients here, because those nutrients are getting carried in by the fresh water. So there's lots of nutrients for producers, and so then the consumers can eat those producers, and they can eat decaying matter, and then they don't consume all of it. So some of it also then gets distributed throughout the ocean. So estuaries can be very diverse, and they can be very productive ecosystems and help to contribute to the balance of the balance that we see in nature. Okay, so that, I know that's a lot, but that covers modules 9 and module 10 for Cornerstone Marine Biology.